must constantly look at things in a different way.
The Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast was created by two physical therapists out of the desire to learn more about the different educational roles in physical therapy and healthcare, and how healthcare education works by talking with educational leaders and people with different perspectives within physical therapy and across interdisciplinary lines on how education can be improved to disrupt the status quo of healthcare education. This is our journey, and thanks for listening. Are you a third-year physical therapy student that excels on tests when you have study guides, checklists, and deadlines? With all of the information available about how to prepare for the NPTE, it's easy to get disorganized and not feel prepared going into the big day. NPTE Prep Success is an online course that provides PT students easy-to-use study guides and step-by-step guidance through the NPTE preparation. To learn more, visit kylericeprep.com. Thank you again all for your continued support, and now for the show. Hey everybody, and thanks for listening to another episode of the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. This is Brandon speaking, and before we get to today's episode, I wanted to take a moment to share the behind the scenes regarding our coverage of the PT Residency Fellowship issue. At the HET Podcast, we are committed to providing you with diverse perspectives on topics and issues that you care about. We want to inform you about the logistics we encountered when we recorded these series of interviews. You may have noticed that we have had a lack of episodes discussing ABTPRFE's perspective on the change in regulations in fellowships and residencies. Most of our interviews have covered the program's perspective on this issue. I'm going to tell you why. First, we highly recommend that you read all of the available information on both perspectives and consider this issue from all angles. Now, we have provided some resources in our show notes for consideration, so please check those out as well. As for logistics, ABTA policy requires all media, including our podcast, to coordinate interviews with board members or representatives of ABTPRFE through the ABTA public relations team. Now, over the last few months, we have been collaborating with ABTA to feature an ABTPRFE board of director on this very important topic for a podcast episode. We have a date to touch base for scheduling an interview with them in April. Hopefully, we will be able to share their viewpoint through our podcast around that date. I hope this sheds some light on our perspective and content. Now, without further ado, here's our interview. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. I am one of your hosts, and I'm Brandon Pullen. And of course, as always, I'm joined by my fellow co-host, F. Scott Fiel. And today we have the esteemed pleasure of talking with Dr. Elaine Lonnemann, who is the current president of the American Academy of Orthopedic Manual Physical Therapists, or throughout this podcast, we're going to call it AAOMPT for short, along with being the current program director of the Transitional DPT Program at the University of St. Augustine. And we brought Elaine on today to focus on the perspective on residency and fellowship education from AAOMPT's point of view, along with discussing some of her thoughts and kind of her perspective being in her position within AAOMPT. Well, Elaine, thank you so much for your time and your service. You have done a ton for the profession. And I recognize, though, of course, that some of our listeners may not know much about you. Would you mind just kind of sharing a little bit of some brief background into kind of who you are and kind of about your journey with how you got involved in AAOMPT to where you are now as the president?
Of course. And thank you for asking me to talk with you. So first and foremost, I'm a mother of 4 wonderful boys. My husband is also a physical therapist and happens to be a fellow of AAOMPT. I live on a small farm in southern Indiana, which is near Louisville, Kentucky. And I graduated actually from a physical therapy program at the University of Louisville. So after I graduated, I went on to practice in East Tennessee in an orthopedic clinic there. And I was fortunate to have a mentor in orthopedics, Dwayne Williams, who recommended that I take some continuing education courses from this guy named Stanley Paris. And I realized starting those courses that I had a lot to learn. And that actually took me down the path of residency and fellowship. And I had already been a member of ABTA since I'd been a student. I actually started a leadership role as a physical therapy student for our APTA group. But when I became a resident, I realized that service is pretty much an expectation. And if you're going to be a professional, it's part of it. So I started volunteering in AAOMPT because AAOMPT had just formed. I was in the residency in 1991 and AAOMPT had just formed. So I was I had the opportunity to hear kind of the inner workings of the beginnings of standard development and all of those things. It was a great learning opportunity. But, that I think brought me along a path that service brought me along the path to leadership and academics, because I started teaching at spinal manipulation courses later, a few years later, actually in 98. And then I started teaching in a first professional program at Bellarmine University when we moved closer to home in Louisville. And then I taught in the first professional program, and I've worked in clinical practice throughout my teaching or my tenure as a teacher. And then I'll just last year took the program director position for the Transitional DPT. So that has brought me from a career standpoint where I'm at. From a leadership perspective in AAOMPT, I started serving in committees and, talked with people and asked where I could get involved, and served 2 terms as a secretary on the AAOMPT board and just loved it. I learned a lot about leadership and got to meet some amazing people. And that's really why I chose to run for president, because I really love serving the people in AAOMPT. They're amazing people, and they're so passionate about what they do, and that energizes me. So that's where I am now. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, Elaine, I actually finished my transitional doctorate through St. Augustine's program, as well as my educational doctorate. So it's a great program. I can't wait to see what you do with it in the future. But what I'd like to hear about tonight is, what exactly is AAOMPT, and how did AAOMPT form and transform to where it is now?
Absolutely. So it was formed actually in 1991, when, as I mentioned, when I was there. And it was really formed just so physical therapists in the U.S. could specialize in manual therapy and have a common national voice in the U.S. And when the founding members, there were 8 founding members who started it, a group of individuals who I think were very visionary. They had several objectives in mind for AAOMPT and why they wanted to create it. So they wanted to create this organization where people could confer, they could meet, promote research, clinical practice at conferences, and they also wanted to develop a national accreditation for our residencies. So they developed standards by which the accreditation could occur. And the reason they wanted to start the national accreditation is because they were planning to develop residencies, and they knew that in order to become a member of IFOMPT, they would need to demonstrate that we were measuring and evaluating and assessing our orthopedic manual physical therapy program. So that's kind of where the path of accreditation and our credentialing and standards started. And the other part was just, not only to be a part of IFOMPT, but to collaborate with ABTA to really meet the goals of our profession. Yeah, I think, I mentioned they were visionaries, but they really developed a framework for the future of fellowship education. I think they were very thoughtful and intentional about the standards. If you look at the initial standards, and their vision of residencies at that time, it was called a residency, but residencies and fellowships was really a place where PTs wouldn't just learn skills or gain knowledge, and that's what I think a lot of people think, oh, manual therapy is just about the skills that you do. But it was really to provide a solid foundation to create new knowledge, to create research. And, they wanted to develop individuals who would lead through clinical practice and research and teaching. And I think they've done a great job at setting that foundation.
Yeah, for sure. So to kind of understand from an organizational standpoint, how does the executive board and staff work together to achieve AAOMPT's mission?
So we work together to meet the mission of AAOMPT really by trying to collaborate with all the groups. So part of AAOMPT's mission is to collaborate nationally and internationally and to promote the research, to promote good clinical practice, excellence in OMPT. And so we, try to be collaborators with other groups, with APTA, with IFOMPT, develop excellence in our conference programming. We're trying to provide opportunities for the research that our members are creating, and keeping it, top of the line research, and also really just getting awareness out there about what orthopedic manual physical therapists do, what they can do, and about their clinical reasoning. So those are the ways that we're working together to reach the mission of AAOMPT.
So knowing that, when I kind of first heard about how all these organizations between APTA, ABTRI, AAOMPT, and IFOMPT, and how they all integrate together in a residency fellowship education, I'm not going to lie, I was like reading that for about 3 to 5 days, just trying to wrap my head around exactly how that all works. And I know that Talis Media has done some great work with their articles, looking at that web of influence, kind of breaking that down. But, for those who aren't exactly clear of this dynamic, would you mind just kind of sharing the Cliff Notes version, shall you say, of how these organizations all work together to progress PT post-professional education?
Absolutely. That is quite a challenge. I agree. It's a little bit confusing, but if you look at the organization, IFOMPT is a specialty subgroup of the World Confederation of Physical Therapy. And IFOMPT is the organization that really oversees manual therapy from an international perspective, or an international level. And so they look at educational standards, international standards, and practice guidelines. And that's part of the process that they're working with. And, they vetted these international standards in manual therapy over a period of 40 years. So in order to become, for AAOMPT to become a member of IFOMPT, a manual therapy organization has to meet the standards that IFOMPT has developed in their manual therapy programs, in their residencies or fellowships. And it also has to be, AAOMPT also had to be recognized by the country's parent professional association, which in our case is APTA. And the other part of this is APTA is also a member of the WCDP. But so APTA has recognized AAOMPT as the United States member organization to IFOMPT. So we went to the orthopedic section, and the orthopedic section initiated that discussion with us. And APTA has chosen us as the group that represents manual physical therapy in the U.S. So that's how we are part of IFOMPT, and IFOMPT has to look at WCPT requirements for its member organizations as well. Now, as far as ABTRI goes, so ABTRI is the American Board of Physical Therapy Residency and Fellowship Education, and I'll say ABTRI for short from here on out, but it is recognized by APTA as the agency for accrediting physical therapy residency and fellowship education programs. So our fellowship programs work with ABTRI, or under ABTRI, because they accredit our program to make sure that we are meeting the standards that they have set forth in the U.S. for orthopedic manual therapy.
I want to dive a little bit more into the standards component of this, if you will, because you had kind of alluded to that. Now, we'll be having Dr. Allison Rushton, who, for those of you who aren't aware, she is the current chair of the IFOMPT Standards Committee. We're going to have her on in the future to discuss the IFOMPT standards in a bit more depth. But just to kind of get an overview here, what are the biggest differences between the IFOMPT, AAOMPT, and the ABTRI standards among residency and fellowship programs? And I get that it's going to be specialty dependent, but at least from your perspective, what are some of the biggest differences that are kind of seen across all domains, if there are any?
Yeah, I think I can give you the Cliff Notes version of that. If you are going into, say, just an ABTRI OMPT fellowship, not an AAOMPT that's using IFOMPT standards, both programs are going to require about the same amount of time, although IFOMPT is a little less prescriptive, but AAOMPT has always gone with about 1,000 hours total. And you're going to have to complete that within 5 years maximum and a 10-month minimum in an ABTRI program. And within that, this is where it varies. In an ABTRI program, you have 850 patient care or actual clinic hours out of those 1,000, okay? And of those 850, 150 need to be one-on-one with a mentor, okay? And then also within that 1,150 need to be educational hours. So you're looking at clinical practice, educational hours as your two divisions, and 150 are the required educational hours. And within that clinical practice, 150 are one-on-one with a mentor. Now, the difference in an AAOMPT fellowship would be the hours vary a little bit. So IFOMPT standards requires AAOMPT programs to include 200 hours of educational programming versus the 150 in an ABTRI. And IFOMPT standards also require 150 hours of practical skills education. So working with development of technique and skill development with patients. And they also require a minimum of 150 hours of mentored clinical practice. So that mentored one-on-one practice is the same, but the difference is the mentor. And I think this is a very significant difference, because in an AAOMPT program, the mentor has to be a fellow. If you are in a program with ABTRI, the requirements are less. You could have someone who has an OCS or a certification through the ABTPS that applies to the specialty area. That could be your mentor. Or you could have someone who has just graduated from an ABTRI residency in orthopedics as your mentor. Or you could have someone who has demonstrated significant experience in orthopedic manual physical therapy and has practiced for 2 years. So if you look at the comparison, the typical fellow of AAOMPT has more experience, years of experience, and has gone through, a vetted process where you have oral and practical examinations. And so the mentorship piece, I think, is the significant difference. And there's one other area which I think really plays into the vision that our founders had, is that IFOMPT requires that a fellow be able to demonstrate some understanding as well as application of research. And that is a part of that knowledge creation piece that, I think the founding members thought was so important. So, if you look at our profession, if it weren't for research, we probably wouldn't have survived. And the founding members instilled that requirement or that objective through their standards. And IFOMPT standards, which we have now adopted, also includes that and feels that's very important. And that is not part of the ABTRI requirement.
So, going off that, Elaine, if the original standards, as you say, were developed by IFOMPT, and I understand that, of course, you are not working as an ABTRI representative, but from your understanding, what is the reasoning or rationale that ABTRI is using their own standards and having these differences that you were kind of just talking about?
Yeah, so part of that is the history of how, the collaboration occurred. So I mentioned that the standards were developed in 93, and then in 94, AAOMPT started recognizing the programs who were meeting those standards. And that recognition process became also described as credentialing. And AAOMPT did our own credentialing until 2001. And that's the point when AAOMPT and the ABTA agreed that the ABTA really should take over the responsibility of credentialing OMPT residency fellowship programs. And ABTA accepted the critical elements of AAOMPT standards. And they said they would only credential programs if those standards had been met. So AAOMPT agreed to this for several reasons, because people have asked, why did this transition occur? First, we had a volunteer group. Our standards committee members were doing the credentialing and the reviewing of the program, and it's a tremendous amount of work. And the AAOMPT board recognized that as programs continue to grow, that it probably wouldn't be sustainable for an organization to do their own credentialing. And APTA's future vision was to have an accreditation agency or credentialing agency in the ABTRI program. And it also, we went into this, we had no reason not to think that ABTA wouldn't meet the standards or wouldn't credential programs based on our standards because that was the initial agreement. So we went into that with good faith with APTA. And, it made sense also. If you think about, AAOMPT really valued fellowship and residency training and knows that this is really some of the best education you can get. And in the future, it makes sense that our national organization would develop residencies and fellowships in all areas. And so manual therapy residencies were the first residencies to develop. And whenever we established that relationship, we brought 20 fellowship programs into APTA. And that was that's a lot of work to review those programs. But we also then helped APTA develop some of the standards. We collaborated with them on a lot of different projects on the manipulation task force, but also it assisted in developing some of the standards, some of the generic standard templates with the members like Carol Jo Tishner and Trish King, who were very involved in the development of the standards. Actually, in 2012, IFOMPT determined that the U.S. was not meeting the requirements of international monitoring. So in order to maintain our membership organization status, we have to submit an international monitoring document every 6 years that describes how we are meeting IFOMPT standards. And so the basis for us not meeting these requirements, there were several areas, but mainly it was related to a feedback loop that was needed between the ABTRI reviewers giving feedback to AAOMPT programs or to the AAOMPT board, and there were confidentiality issues. And as you can imagine, they're doing accreditation, so we had to work on developing that feedback loop. And Kendra Harrington of ABTRI worked with us at that time to help make those changes so we could maintain our membership. And along the way, throughout that time, there were changes in IFOMPT standards. So it's normal for standards to change. In fact, over time, it's a good thing. IFOMPT looks at their standards every 10 years. But there was a change in IFOMPT standards that was important in terms of mentorship that we had to include. And the timing didn't sync with ABTRI's timing to change their standards. So, it's really important for an accreditation agency to follow procedures for making changes to their standards. And so this was out of order. So I guess what I'm trying to say is no one was trying to be difficult, but it was challenging to make all of this work at the time. And ABTRI did make it work because the timeframes were close enough. They were able to change the standards. But I think that's part of the history that's important, and ABTRI was very helpful in that process. But then ABTRI hired a consultant to make suggestions, and that to improve basically their processes. And also, so one of the future goals of ABTRI is to be recognized by the U.S. Department of Education, and that's important. Because it says that your accreditation agency is working well, it's in good order, but it's also important because then the students or the residents can get federal funding for loans if they should need them. And, looking into the future, if residency and fellowship becomes mandatory, and I don't know that that's going to happen, but if it does, it would be nice for ABTRI to have all of this in place. And so the external auditor also suggested some other changes, and those changes, as well as the lack of AAOMPT's feedback on the standards at the time the window was open, really has created a situation where there are two sets of standards for OMPT fellowship. You have ABTRI standards and AAOMPT standards. And it's not necessarily a bad thing that ABTRI has a set of standards, because what they're trying to do is streamline those standards to go across all fellowship programs. So whether it's sports, upper extremity athletes, hand fellowships, they wanted to have a specific set of standards. But then there are IFOMPT standards, which we have to adopt and use in order to stay part of IFOMPT. So the other thing that changed, besides that there are two sets of standards, and you're kind of asking where we are, and the other thing that changed was the requirement, the entry requirement. And so now individuals who apply to residency have to either have an OCS, their orthopedic certification, or they have to have completed a residency. And while we hope that all programs who apply will want their fellows to be AAOMPT fellows, it really creates an option for someone to graduate with lower standards, and the entry level has made it hard for some programs. So some of the program directors are having difficulty finding residents who meet those criteria. So the streamlining is good and reducing variation. And like I said, all fellowship programs would be reviewed with the same criteria, and we understand that need for streamlining. But it has created a situation where AAOMPT will now have to evaluate curricular hours in different areas. So I mentioned the differences in the hours. So that's something that we would have to do differently, and really kind of go back closer to where we were in 2000 when we were credentialing versus the way it was in 2013. And in 2013, we had the external assessor process for the international monitoring through IFOMPT. And you had an ABTRI reviewer who was a fellow of AAOMPT who did the ABTRI review. So that second part was then just the check off to look at, are they doing the research component and various aspects of mentoring? So in 2013, it was a lot easier, but now it's created a different perspective.
There certainly seems to be a lot of good intent behind some of these changes. Like you had said, making it more streamlined, getting that accreditation so that ultimately students and residents can get federal funding. And I think that's a good thing to work toward. And I know that a few other program directors have kind of mentioned that, some of these requirements aren't necessarily a bad thing, but it's just the timing. Would you agree or disagree with that, Elaine?
I would definitely agree. And I think that the timing issue, and we're still fairly young. If you look at the infancy of residency and fellowship as compared to, say, pharmacy and some of the other medicine, we're pretty young, and I think our expectations are fairly high for a young profession in the residency fellowship program category. So I think timing is a significant issue.
Clearly, there are some unintended consequences here to the situation here. But let's talk a little bit more about what's the communication been to kind of address this. So what has been the communication between AAOMPT, other stakeholders, and ABTRI regarding some of these controversial changes since these requirements were first made known?
Yeah, so ABTRI has been open to communication. Their communication processes are basically, if you have a complaint, you bring it to the staff. The staff takes the complaint, typically in a letter or email format, and will bring it, the compiled complaints to the ABTRI board, and the board reviews the complaint and responds. And I have had some personal communications with the chair of ABTRI over this tenure. So they have been willing to talk with us and, explain their rationale and some of the background, just so that I can help members understand, what the intent is. And so I've been able to do that, as well as with Sharon Dunn and other APTA board members. And I think that program directors have also talked to APTA board members and have sent multiple letters. I think this last incident that I've seen so far, in terms of, not really an incident, since the rules changed related to the site visits, and there have been complaints that have come in. We've had AAOMPT members submit 93 emails to ABTRI since, I guess that would be December, just related to concerns over that. So that's the mechanism for communication from membership, and that's pretty much a standard for accreditation groups or credentialing groups to submit. Oftentimes, and now ABTRI is developing a standards committee, and so those complaints will be vetted by them, and hopefully the communication and the timeframes will be a little quicker in terms of turnaround. But they've been, they definitely have been open to communicate or to hear us. It's taken a little bit longer to get back, but part of that is, they're a volunteer board as well. But I think that, there are some critical issues, and timing is so important, and that has been a little bit difficult at times. Another mechanism we have for communication has been the ABTRI representative, or the AAOMPT representative on the ABTRI board. And currently that representative is Samantha Gubka. She's a fellow of AAOMPT. So she also brings our concerns. She's been CC'd on many of the emails and concerns from the board, and we've had many discussions, and she's also involved with, communicating with the program directors related to their concerns and bringing that back to the ABTRI board.
And kind of going off that a little bit with kind of all of the emails and messages that have been sent to ABTRI, and seeing that the APTA Board of Directors has relatively recently convened a focus group with stakeholders from APTA, ABTRI, and programs to discuss these concerns and collaborate together near the end of April. And, of course, knowing that everyone would frankly like to collaborate together to move forward as one. But let's kind of go down a couple of roads here just to kind of talk hypothetical on what could happen. So let's start with positive. So if compromise could be met amongst all stakeholders, how would you hypothesize that things would progress and play out?
Well, and I'll take a step back, because the focus group meeting is really to hear, they want to hear constructive feedback. When I hear the word compromise, it means there's some negotiation that has taken place, and I don't think there's going to be any negotiation. I think that the ABTRI board and the APTA board, the members that are present and the staff, are going to listen to the concerns of the stakeholders, and probably will take those concerns, just like qualitative research. They're going to look at the themes, the effects that the programs, that really the unintended consequences that are occurring, and they'll look at those and compare them to the rationale for why they initiated those policies. And I think a lot of the rationale is coming back to that addition of 3 sites is directly stated in the U.S. Department of Education guidelines. And so they're going to listen to our feedback. Now, if I could hypothesize that, the solutions were brought forward, I would like to think that maybe they could step back from a timing perspective, because really accreditation or credentialing is a voluntary decision. And there are a lot of different healthcare organizations out there that are, are becoming accredited or want to become accredited based on their standards. But, I think that in the best world, if they could slow down the process a little bit so that everything can be vetted, and maybe also recognize that a lot of these residency and fellowship program directors are clinicians who are not used to, language of standards, and, are busy in the clinic. And of course they have responsibilities, but maybe increasing the length of time for turnaround for some of these things, because it's great that they want to be accredited. They don't have to do that. And I really just hope that we can continue to, include these programs and have them want to be part of this accreditation, as part of our entire profession. So I guess if I hypothesize on the negative side, that over time, I'm concerned that programs are going to decide, well, you know what, we're going to do a manual therapy residency, but it's not going to be accredited. It's not going to be recognized. And we'll just market it as that and go from there. We've got, maybe it's a big enough program, or they have a name. They've, some of these programs who are considering stepping away were the grassroots programs that, came over in 2001 and had some concerns. But again, like you said, we stood in good faith that APTA would meet IFOMPT standards. And it's not that they're restricting our standards. they're just not implementing them. And they have said that, and again, I've heard that you can't have two sets of standards. Maybe that's because it's not streamlining enough. I've heard that people say that, that you won't become accredited by these national organizations, the Council on Higher Education Accreditation, CHIA, or U.S. Department of Education. But, in this process that as we've gone through this process, one of the things that I've done is looked at in association with some of our task force members is I started looking at all the different accreditation agencies, and there are some fellowships, or there are some like healthcare professions, say the dentist, they have two different standards for their fellowship programs in dentistry. And so, and they are USDE, or U.S. Department of Education recognized. So, I'm just not going to, I want to make sure that we've vetted this fully. I don't want us just to sit back and say, well, these are the requirements and that's it, because if it can be done differently and it can work for our profession, where our profession is at this current time, then I really would like that to happen. And there are other groups, like, for example, the graduate medical education. So physicians. Now, physicians they are accredited through a different group that doesn't have CHIA or USDE recognition, but they have standards for cardiovascular surgeons that are different than pediatricians versus internal medicine fellows. So there's a lot of groups, and it just makes sense, because I would want my cardiovascular surgeon to have different standards than, say, maybe my internal medicine or family practice physician. And so, and maybe that's a bit of a stretch. We are talking about, manual physical therapy, but really we're looking at the whole body as compared to, say, the upper extremity athlete. And the other thing is there are other fellowship programs that came into this wanting higher standards like sports. And part of that's probably the role of safety in terms of extra hours. And again, they're not limiting us, but as we continue, and we are going, part of the reason AAOMPT developed was to be part of IFOMPT. And so we're going to continue to use IFOMPT standards, but it's going to require significant changes in our external assessor process that's really closer to credentialing. And I don't know that people are going to want to go through two separate processes of credentialing.
No, I hear you. That might get a little expensive too. Thinking from a student resident perspective here. And, kind of going off of that, Elaine, you mentioning that these other professions and providers have kind of been able to kind of make something work along those lines. Can AAOMPT do their own accreditation if, maybe the results of the focus group maybe don't go the way that perhaps is wanted?
Well, that's a great question, and that's something that we've been thinking about. The AAOMPT board appointed a task force to do a feasibility study to see if we can do our own credentialing, either internally with our association management team, or to find an accreditation agency externally who would be willing to use IFOMPT standards and still hold the same rigor of standards. Because one of the things that we don't want is we want to maintain these standards, and I think AAOMPT's been the leader in that, and we've required our fellows to our minimum standards. Many of our programs are going well above the minimum standards because that's the expectation. Excellence. So we are looking into it, and it is possible that would occur. I would certainly hope it wouldn't, because I think we're better off if our association has one group that accredits, and we can stay under the same umbrella and work better collaboratively. But if we have to, we will move on.
No, I mean, that makes complete sense. And based on, kind of, you had mentioned about the feasibility with AAOMPT doing accreditation. Would you mind just kind of sharing a little bit more on, is it feasible, is it not?
So, I mean, we have learned, as we suspected, that it's expensive and that the resources it's going to take a lot of resources to do our own credentialing accreditation to the level that ABTRI is, and it's one of the reasons the APTA board wanted the motion to pass is because they've been, funding ABTRI as the accreditation agency and, wanted to make sure that the membership agreed that that's, what they should continue to do, because it takes a lot of software updates and resources that, are very costly. So, we're really still in the beginning stages. From my perspective, just from looking at some of the different professions who have, who are using several sets of standards, it seems to me that there should be a way that we can continue to work with ABTRI, or ABTRI would work with us to meet the IFOMPT standards. And I can't really say yes we can do it, or the other things that we've learned along the way, because we again only initiated the process. And, we have several subgroups who are working together to bring back the information. And actually our next meeting is Wednesday.
Because obviously some people are probably wondering if that does happen, and what are AAOMPT programs most concerned about? Because, I mean, I'm sure a lot of residents and fellows in training were kind of relatively nervous that they wouldn't be accredited or it wouldn't be worth anything.
Yeah, I think the biggest current issues for the programs, and we've had at least one program that has closed because they didn't have the applicant pool, because their applicant pool didn't consist of residency graduates or individuals with an OCS. And so I think the entry-level criteria change has been a concern for some, and not all, but the majority. And then the other big concern for the larger multi-site programs is the new site visit requirement. And the site visit requirement is the purpose of that is, as programs grow, accreditation agencies want to make sure that these groups have, the growth isn't, like a degree mill in a college, right? So that this is not just a substandard development of multiple areas of clinical practice or for the fellowship. So, there's the concern from an ABTRI's perspective is that there are, and I can't really speak for ABTRI, so I'm not, but safety is an issue for accreditation agencies, safety for the fellow, for the patient, and, they just want to make sure that the groups are meeting the standards as they continue to grow. And, but that's going to be a huge expense, especially for some of the residency programs that are out there, or some of the hybrid programs, the multi-site. And so there have been AAOMPT programs who have called me and said, we cannot sustain this type of activity, which is why, APTA's created the focus group.
Right. And Elaine, do you think it'd be a reasonable accommodation that, since doing a live site visit is going to be much more financially straining to programs, then ultimately residents and fellows would have to pick up the tab, would there be an option potentially to doing a site visit through using technology so that costs could be significantly saved?
Yeah, I don't know the full answer to that. I've looked at some of the Council on Higher Education, the changes that they have made, and it seems like, even they are saying, we have to work within the times, but I think that and again, this is not my area of expertise. There's probably someone out there that knows that, a physical site visit is more accurate than a, technological Zoom meeting or, webcam or robot. I don't know. So I don't know. I'm guessing there's data out there, but I haven't seen it, and I don't know. I think that it's just kind of been, as I look at these other accreditation agencies, it does seem like the site visit, if they're requiring a site visit, so for example, pharmacy residencies require a physical site visit for every physical space. So if there's an addition, then you have to have a site visit at that space regardless. Now, looking at that, again, pharmacy residencies have been around since the 60s. It's probably maybe a different issue in terms of safety, maybe even, in terms of cost, but they do require every site. However, if you look at some other programs like optometry or the osteopathic programs, and the correspondence and the rules and regulations that I've seen from their perspective, and the graduate medical education, so physicians, what they consider appropriate for site visits is that you have a sponsoring institution, and there may be several sites in the local area that they would go visit, or if they had a flag of a site, for some reason they were concerned about a site, they would go physically visit that site. But otherwise, they're reviewing the documents from the program directors and the feedback, all of the documentation that has to occur with the development of a program or the ongoing workings of a program. So, I think it is feasible, especially with the technology that we have these days. And I just think that, we need to continue to look at all avenues with that. So yes, I do think that is possible, but do I think that that's the way it's been done? And if we're comparing ourselves to other groups, they typically have had a physical site visit, but pharmacy residencies are the only ones that I've seen. And again, I'm not an expert in this, and ABTPRFE certainly has more information than I do. I've just kind of skimmed the surface, and I will be the first to admit that. But what I am finding is that there is variation, and I'm wondering, could we, as a profession, kind of step back, look at some of the options that would work for our industry? We see what's happening in some of the other. Could those options work for us? If it works for medicine, is it possible that it could work for physical therapy?
I'm going to switch gears here a little bit and kind of get off this issue just a little. But what do you see, apart from what we had talked about, what do you see as the biggest issue in post-professional education? And what do you see as the solution to these issues to really develop the best post-professional programs we can get?
Well, I guess I'll start with the premise that I think that in both post-professional and first professional education, so in physical therapy, academic instruction, that is really the foundation for our profession. And I think we can't forget that. And so I think from a post-professional standpoint, we really are right now developing the framework for future residencies and fellowships. And we need to be very thoughtful and intentional in how we're developing that framework and make sure that our standards are the standards that we want to keep. And I think that if you look at, like I said before, the founding fellows didn't develop standards or objectives that would just train people with skills. They developed standards that would include knowledge creation, and that's the big research word. And I know students and clinicians get a little alarmed when they hear the research word. But again, if we don't include that in our post-professional programs, if that goes away, and I think that's the beauty of the IFOMPT standards, we just as a profession need to embrace how we can integrate research and do it right. So, you're learning a lot in fellowship, and you recognize that the importance of critical appraisal of research, as well as, being able to apply it to, a research question. So all of that is significantly important. But I think in the future that we can really assist programs and clinicians who have got excellent questions. I mean, I think there's a lot of research that could be done, if there was a little bit more interaction, because clinicians have great ideas, but we have to be able to set it up so that the research that's being done is meaningful, so that you're not getting clinical trials of 30 people, right? And that type of research is hard to do, but I think, with the Foundation for Research in Physical Therapy, that, we can collaborate with these groups, and AAOMPT has done that as well, but to get higher level research and so not only promote research, but promote excellence in clinical practice and teaching. So I guess that would be how my solution to that would be to make sure that we integrate all of those things in the requirements for our standard, in the requirements for our residency and fellowship programs. I don't know if you were able to attend the Maley lecture that Cornelia Kulig did, and Cornelia is one of our founding members. And one of the things that she said really stuck with me. She talked about kind of the key ingredients, for residencies and fellowships. And she said residencies and fellowships need to be optimal and not just suitable. And I think those are very wise words. I think we need to shoot for optimal and not just minimal or suitable.
No, I completely agree. And, it's been interesting just gathering and learning all those avenues with my program thus far. I mean, I'm still very early in the program, but really going through, like you had kind of mentioned, those research, education, and all those different avenues, I think definitely, it's transformative. I mean, there's just no other way to put it. But, if I didn't have that, I'd kind of wonder, would it really be worth it? Because that's kind of one of the reasons why I decided to pursue this, along with, obviously getting better with integration with what I had knew, and also kind of refined clinical reasoning with people that had really have a lot more years of practice and a lot more expertise on that. So I'm completely with you that we have to shoot for the stars rather than settle for the minimum.
Yeah, and that's the problem too. If you have minimum standards, that's going to affect our entire profession, and we can't have that. So we really do need to speak up and make sure that we meet those standards, and make sure that the individuals who are graduating from residencies and fellowships are individuals who, people will look to, because they're going to represent our profession and are the future. So.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, Elaine. So I gotta ask you our final question here, which is kind of our big cheese, if you will, because we're always curious what everyone's going to say on this last answer. And you may have touched on it earlier in this episode. And if you want, if you want to think of something different, that's completely fine. Because for this question, since we're the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, of course we have to ask, if you could change one aspect of healthcare education, whether that be entry, post-professional, or otherwise, which aspect would you change, and how would you change it?
Yeah, I will go with something a little different than we've been discussing. Beyond the framework, developing a strong framework for residencies, I would say access to residencies and fellowship programs for individuals across the U.S. So access from the perspective of location, or the ability to do hybrid programs, to get mentors, to find mentors that can mentor them, because I really feel like mentorship is the key, and that's the value that residencies and fellowships bring to practitioners. So I would say access, whether it be financial, physical, or from a location standpoint. And I think that will also bring a more inclusive group into our residencies and fellowship programs. So if I could wave the magic wand and make sure that everyone has, the finances and the resources to attend residencies and fellowships, that's what I would like to do, because I had such a great opportunity to learn and, become a leader and a professional because of the mentorship I received. So I would love to pay that forward.
No, that'd be quite an amazing magic wand to have that, to be able to do that. Because, and part of it, like you had said, I think from talking with a lot of students and from talking with a lot of people, it seems like the biggest elephant in the room is cost. Because I know there are so many very dedicated clinicians that would love to pursue that, but the dollars just don't really add up for that. And plus, with residency and fellowship being in its relative infancy, it's hard to get all the profession really on board that that's something we should do, because not all employers value it and reward it the same way. So I know we got a little bit of work ahead of us.
Mm-hmm. We have a lot.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. Well, Elaine, I understand, and thank you so much for coming on this evening to chat about this stuff and share your insight on this, because I've definitely learned a few things regarding the accreditation, but also kind of some of the other avenues behind this big pressing issue with residency and fellowship. But I recognize that other people out there who are listening might have follow-up questions or might want to learn a little bit more on some of the stuff. Where would you recommend that they kind of look or reach out if they kind of have a question?
So they're always welcome to contact me. Contact me by email. My email is elonnemann@usa.edu. They could also, if they just want to peruse some information, they can go to the AAOMPT website, to our different fellowship programs. There's some information within the AAOMPT website, as well as ABTPRFE's website. ABTPRFE does a nice job with having information out there in terms of access and different locations, and explains things about, the differences in residencies and fellowships and the different areas. So I would say the ABTPRFE website or the AAOMPT Fellowship Program website.
Perfect, guys. And if you want to check that out, just go ahead and scroll down or check the show notes, because those links are right there. So you just have to click them and it'll take you right there. Well, Elaine, thank you so much again for your time, for your service, and for all that you've done and that you'll continue to do. I can't tell you how much we greatly appreciate your efforts and service. And thank you also again for coming on.
Well, thank you. It was my privilege, and it's really my privilege to serve our profession and AAOMPT. Thank you.
Access to healthcare is one of the largest issues facing both providers and patients, as millions of people worldwide lack timely and affordable access to healthcare. Anywhere Healthcare, a telehealth platform, is a simple, low-cost option for providers and patients that eliminates the barriers to access to all kinds of healthcare. To find out more, check out anywhere.healthcare, which is available on our show notes. And if you use the code HET in all caps when you email to sign up, you'll save 25% off the total cost. Thank you for attending class today, and we hope that you learned something and gained value from the content.
If you'd like to schedule office hours with us, feel free to add us on Twitter at HET Podcast, on Instagram, HET Podcast, on Facebook, the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, and the homepage, healthcareeducationtransformationpodcast.com.
And for those of you following along in the syllabus, extra credit can be obtained by liking us, sharing us, and leaving a review.
Let's continue our journey up Mount Educational Success as lifelong learners.